and there were lots of issues and learning curve things there. But
yeah, we don't want that today. All right, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Michael with United Veterans Worldwide for an interview today. Actually, more of a discussion than an interview with Beth. She and I had a chance to connect this last week on the phone, and I found her to be an absolutely intelligent and wonderful individual whose vision and purpose really and truly inspired me. And so I want to introduce us to Beth today. Beth, would you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Well, first, thanks so much for having me, Michael. I started my career as a civilian intelligence analyst working for the Department of the Army with the National Ground Intelligence Center. I was really focused on Afghanistan, wanted to make a positive impact there. I left that career in 2013 to pursue being a wife and mother. And then when the withdrawal happened, I really jumped headfirst into trying to resolve so much pain that was radiating out of that. And it led to me having a much more serious writing career. Right now, you can find my work in the Washington Examiner and Fox News Digital, and also started my own podcast with my good friend Michael Cook. It's the Afghanistan Project podcast. And yeah, I'm just every day steeped in all of the tragedy of Afghanistan, but it's been a blessing in a strange way.
Yeah, well, thank you for that introduction, and I'm so glad that you mentioned your writing and where you've contributed. And I've read some of those details, and it's fantastic. You know, you mentioned something that's very sensitive to our hearts as veterans and our minds. When Afghanistan was suddenly the doors were slammed shut, it wasn't a slow closure. We lost 13 service members at the end at the airport in that suicide detonation. And I've interviewed several folks already who have talked through some of that have lived in Southern California, that have known the families and the people who lived there and the suffering. And for myself, that day when we finally exited in such an abrupt manner, repeating history that happened in Korea, I went into a tailspin. I really struggled with my mental health for 4 or 5 days, and I really didn't attribute it to that, honestly, because I assumed that I never served in Afghanistan while I trained, troops to go there. My battle was Iraq, so I was like, this won't really affect me, but wow. And my spouse, she's so great. She reminded me that that's why I was struggling so bad, and then I had to connect with other guys who I knew were struggling worse, and it really is a challenging, like you said, a really, really challenging situation. Can you tell me about what you got involved in with Afghanistan and how that all took place, what you did?
Well, it started in William & Mary. I went there for undergrad and did a year in DC, and we had to have an internship that matched with our course of study. And so for my first semester, it was post-conflict state reconstruction. It was right between when we were getting ready to depart Iraq and prepare for more troops entering Afghanistan. And I just became obsessed. It's a moment, there are moments that you can't explain. And this is really one of mine. It's a God moment. Like something was compelling me, and it is an obsession, but I prefer describing it that way than just a weird obsession. I, from there, just kind of began to study counterinsurgency, and I guess it's kind of weird to call it a God moment at the same time because, you're studying war, and I was learning all about these great, new advancements in how we could fight the Taliban enemy. And, God isn't telling us how to go, kill people with greater accuracy, but it really, everything changed for me as I prepared to start working at NGIC. I had met a very fantastic young man. He was going through IOC, the infantry officer course in Quantico, and preparing to become a young Marine infantry officer. And I was madly in love with him. And finally, I realized you're preparing to go advise people at this strategic level about our enemy in Afghanistan. And you're so gung-ho about this, but it's the surge. and this man that you love is probably going to go get sent to go fight on like the ground. And I finally began to realize, like, oh, I have skin in the game, and this isn't fun, and this has big implications. And I was just writing about this the other day. I've always been really interested in the sunken war battlefield from Civil War times, the Battle of Fredericksburg. And I remember going there right before I started my intelligence career. I had gone to Fredericksburg to meet up with the young man I was dating. And while he had work, I went and stood in Marie's Heights, it used to be where the Confederates had all of their artillery stacked in the hills to rain down on the Union troops that were trying to assault their very well fortified position. And just standing in that, and there are 15,000 Union graves there. And most of them are mass graves, and 80% of them are unidentified. And just standing there, I thought, okay, like, what you're doing is it's devastatingly important. Don't mess it up. This
sacred ground
on the line. Yeah. Oh yeah. And you have to remember that, like, this is not a game. Mm-hmm. There are people at stake. There's lives at stake. And so I really went into my NGIC career wanting to do all the good I can. And I put a lot of it on my shoulders. I was very serious about my job, and I did really well there. I loved my career. I loved getting every day. Yeah, there were, there's always weird interpersonal things at work. And I had many of those because there are intense debates about, what's really happening, and everybody has their own idea. But I loved every day of going into that office and trying to make a difference.
Yeah, having a purpose-driven occupation is rewarding. It's exhausting at the same time because we end up investing everything we have into it, right? Even from the perspective of a soldier, some of the brightest, most capable, most feeling people worked in the intel sector in my battalions, my brigades, and I love those guys. They really put everything on the line because they knew that whatever they were developing in terms of intel led to eventual safety or catastrophic events.
Yeah, and I knew too, it's like, I was writing for a TS audience, but we were always trying to downgrade our stuff so it could get out to the field. And I didn't date that young Marine for very long into my intel career, being stationed in Southern California and me being in Virginia. It was just not conducive to anything taking off. But he did eventually get sent to Afghanistan, and I was able to pass him, here are things that can help you. And they weren't all products that I had made, but, it was the ability to know you're making a difference for somebody. You're giving them that piece of information that can be the difference between saving lives on a patrol and not saving lives on a patrol. So yeah, it was definitely service driven, and it was exhausting. At the end of the week, most of the weekends I spent on my couch, just laid out from just, being so gung-ho at work.
How did you shut your mind off?
I watched a lot of Snapped and other, you go from these very deadly groups during the week and then women losing it on their husbands on the weekends. It was very weird. I don't know.
To each their own, whatever helps you cope, I guess.
That was my thing. I don't know.
And so he came through conflict okay? You kept in touch with him?
I stayed in touch a little bit. I wrote probably one of my first stories that I wrote, because when I left Intel, I started writing a book, and actually it was loosely based on our love story. And then I realized, okay, I want to start writing shorter pieces too, nonfiction. And I wanted to interview him for the book, just to understand what Helmand was like. And I had never been there. And just meeting up with him, with my husband sitting next to me, and, seeing him for the first time in years, it was an odd experience. Yeah. And then he opened up about being, it was green on blue was really bad at the time. And so He's the man who taught me how to shoot. And so he had asked me, well, did you ever shoot? I think it was a Beretta. And I was like, well, no, you're the only person but I didn't want to say that in front of my husband. I'm like, yeah, I'm like, I don't know. No. And he talked about how he had his Beretta on. He did not have the safe on. He was walking around with it hot just because he never knew if somebody on base who was supposed to be a friendly troop was going to, try to kill him. And how when he came back, and this is a man who, when we dated, he had no fear in his body.
Mm-hmm.
He would blow through red lights. One time I needed to use the bathroom, and he blew through red lights in Alexandria, Virginia, to make sure I could get, he stole bottle service from this rich dude down in Adams Morgan one time. Didn't know what he was doing, but when he found out he wasn't doing the right thing, he didn't stop doing it. And it was he just had no fear.
Yeah.
But listening to him talk about coming back from Afghanistan and having all these plans, which sounded just like him. I'm going to go skiing. I'm going to go do this. And he said he couldn't do it because he just had to decompress. And he didn't realize how much his body needed to rest and how much stress that had put into him. And that hurt my heart in such a huge way that I wrote about it. It was one of my first published nonfiction pieces. So yeah, he's someone I care about very deeply, but we're not super close or anything. To me, he is a symbol for me of all the things that taught me how deep, the feelings are in the veteran community, and really helped me kind of try to bridge that civilian military divide. So he's a very important person for my learning journey. And I'm grateful for him for that.
Yeah, what a unique connection that could give you some of that inside, which is real. I interviewed a friend of mine the other day who was in Afghanistan when some Marine Special Op guys were attacked by their counterpart who was on base helping them out. I think the Taliban probably got to his family and made threats, and he's like, family or these guys? And he chose those guys, and several Marines ended up getting killed, and it ended up being something that was a lasting trauma for his mind. And when we talk about a guy who doesn't put his weapon on safe, obviously that's not safe. But in that scenario where your fight or flight is always in fight, I don't blame a person for always being ready, but how sad it is that we had to be ready in that country specifically, because we didn't really experience as much in Iraq, but that the loyalty changed as a result of some of those threats. And I recently came across a social media post from this monster of a man. He's a giant among guys. Served as a Green Beret. Was attacked. It was the same type of scenario. Someone that they trusted on base turned and killed a bunch of them, and he ended up losing his arm, both of his legs in the firefight. Almost died. But he talks about going back in his mind and saying, yeah, we ended up taking that guy out. He's like, but my heart hurts for that guy's family, because I know that the only reason he turned against us was because the threats on his own family. And he's like, honestly, family first. So it was interesting to hear the forgiveness that this man had. He had no animosity towards this man. Obviously, he's deceased, but still. And you made a one-line comment that I loved, a God moment. This big fellow had a God moment where he's like, I don't blame this guy. I don't have any animosity towards him. He did what he felt was right to protect his family. I would protect my family at whatever cost as well. So walk me through for a minute here, after you took this journey and you gained this insight from this wonderful Marine who had no fear, right? Who we love the fact that the 1%, less than 1% who serve, and even smaller percentage of those who go in are the fighting force. We can't have fear. Or if we do, we have to channel it in a way that still gets things accomplished. But tell me about this journey with Afghanistan after the collapse and what you did and how you got involved.
Yeah, that's a raw one. I just finished writing about that today, actually, for 9/11. So I left in 2013. The the Taliban were set up in their political office in Qatar to negotiate with us. And at the time, there were A, I was getting married. B, the government was threatening shutdowns, and that there were going to be a bunch of people relieved of their positions. And as one of the younger people at NGIC, I thought, okay, well, I'm gone. And it was, those things made it easy altogether to leave. But then I was in my new home, and I remember looking at my phone and seeing that the Taliban had raised their flag over their Qatar office. And I was just so angry. And I didn't have the words or the explanation for that, why it bothered me so much. And now I know, there was nothing I could do anymore. I wasn't in the skiff. I didn't have my ability to reach out to people and say, here's why this is wrong. And I was just so impotently angry that I stopped reading about Afghanistan. And the only way that I dealt with it was writing my novel and going back to the Surge time frame and really getting into historic, it was 2011, 2010, 2011. But for me, it was my history. And I just didn't touch it for years. I think I wrote the odd article, or if someone told me about their war experience, I listened to that, because there's nothing I love more than listening to veterans tell me stories of service. I mean, I was raised by an F-14 Rio, and the best nights after dinner were the ones where he would talk about flying stories or the shenanigans that he got into at the U.S. Naval Academy. Those things always matter to me. But it was probably right in spring of 2021 that I started getting pulled back in. And it started, I was writing a piece about Tunnel to Towers Foundation, and a young man who had been a recipient of one of their homes was talking to me about how the area of Afghanistan that he served in had just come under Taliban control. And I thought, oh no, I can't handle that. I don't want to know about it. I don't want to, because I always knew when I left, this is going to get bad. And it was a question of how bad and how quickly was it going to get bad. There was no question in my mind that the Taliban would return to power in some way at some time. And
you mentioned Tunnel to Towers.
Mm-hmm.
They're having they do an annual run, Tunnel to Towers. I'm actually going to be doing it there here in a couple weeks.
Oh no, that's amazing. Yeah, from the place, do they start at the place where it's the brother, right, was the one who originally did that run from where he left his car and ran all the way. Yeah.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
It's that when I was covering the story, I was only supposed to be talking about the homes that they were building for veterans, but I was just so amazed by the story of the person it's, in honor of, that I included that all in it too. That's the problem with writing about things you care about, is you can't, I'm I can get you 600 words, and then 7,000 words later, I'm there's still more. It's really hard. These are really inspiring people. I'm glad you're doing that. That's really, it's just an incredible organization, and they do great work. I lost where I was. I think I was, so in the lead up to the withdrawal.
Yeah.
April was when it really got bad. So I don't know if you're familiar with Tom Schumann. He goes by Killzone on Instagram. He is very beloved in the service member and veteran community. And he had put out a call for help for his interpreter, who, Zion Al-Azaki, he had fought in Sangin beside Tom. And I say fought because the interpreters in Sangin did fight. I mean, the Taliban were dead set on not letting Sangin fall to anyone. They had killed, I think the British in Sangin, before the Marines took hold, had lost more people in that area than they'd lost in any other part of Afghanistan. And the 3-5 deployment that Tom was on with Zach, they lost more Marines in that deployment than anyone lost in any deployment to Afghanistan subsequently or previously. So it was a really harrowing area. Tom felt very strongly about getting Zach out, and he just put out a call for anybody who could help. And I said, well, I can write about it. And I think I was the first to break the story, but it got then broken open wide by they talked about him on the Senate floor. Rachel Maddow, I think, had him on. he was in the New York Times, I want to say, and the Chicago Sun-Times, like just a wide variety of people covering this story. And he's thinking, great, this will help him get his special immigrant visa. We're going to get him out.
Yeah.
Nothing did that until the actual withdrawal. And I still remember the night that I woke up, because I was always checking during the withdrawal. By the time that August rolled around, I was just obsessed. And I was looking nonstop at what was happening day to day. And I was always wanting to find out, did Zach get out? And I remember seeing Zach, on his way out and thinking, thank goodness. But then in the months that followed, I realized just how many people didn't get out, and just how many Americans had their lives upended by the fact that Afghans who served beside us still weren't out of the country.
So can you describe for me why you would be so concerned about that?
So the Taliban are not a reasonable group of people. And I mean, the reason that interpreters are able to qualify for special immigrant visa, they have to be able to show that there's a threat to their life. Because the Taliban were going out, putting out, what did they call them? Night letters, because they'd put them out at nighttime, saying, so-and-so, we know you're working with the Americans, we're going to kill you. And that happened to interpreters. It happened to prosecutors. If you were a prosecutor who put an Afghan behind bars, if that Afghan or Taliban member, not necessarily an Afghan, I mean, they were ISIS members. If you put a terrorist behind bars, if that terrorist got out of being behind bars, they were going to come find you. And there's evidence throughout the years of our time in Afghanistan where prosecutors were killed leading up to the withdrawal because, they were found. Basically, anything you did to support they called it the puppet government, the government of the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan. The Taliban said it was the puppet of the U.S. And if you supported it, they were going to kill you. And of course, in the media, the Taliban said, we're not going to do that. We're not going to kill people. But it started right away. By November, when I was talking to some of the groups that had formed after the withdrawal, some of the evacuation nonprofits, and there were many of them, one of the first things that someone did, I think it was almost like a purity test. Like, are you really in this, or are you just trying to get a byline about something? And they sent me just an entire file of snuff videos that the Taliban had made and pictures of dead Afghans. And those were not unfamiliar to me. At NJIC, I saw plenty of things, not just of the Taliban either. I mean, it was just, there are heinous people in the world who document heinous things. But those at first really threw me, and I knew, and nobody was reporting on it at the time, that the reprisals were ongoing because everybody was reporting what the Taliban were saying. They're going to be kind to women. They're going to do this. They're going to, and I knew, I know the Taliban. They'll say what they say. But I think my first hashtag, as people were like, look, the Taliban's, I just hashtagged can't trust the Taliban, because it's true. You cannot trust the Taliban, because look at the situation now. Every week I'm seeing more Afghans who fought with us or who were part of the Afghan National Security Forces who are dead because the Taliban found them and tortured them, or found them and, did something terrible. So yeah, that's the long answer to your question. There was a precedent.
I'm glad you said that, because it's important to describe. We're not talking about people whose ideology mindset is the same as ours. We're not talking about people who are like, oh, we had a conflict, the conflict's ended, we can then become friends. A lot of what I do on my channel for uniting veterans worldwide, no matter what flag you fought under, it still has an ethical and moral code that I'm still reaching out to people with that same ethical and moral code. Where there is no ethical or moral code, that still I consider to be enemy. And you mentioned the prosecutors. I've heard stories. I've watched some documentaries about prosecutors, journalists, people who have gotten into government during that time, and they are some of the bravest, most noble people to walk the earth. Almost gets me emotional to think about it, but They were willing to put everything on the line to build and sustain a government with the same vision that we had for our country, and said, if they could do it, we can do it. We can build and have Afghans lead and grow and develop in universities and education and on freedom of speech and blah, blah, blah. The withdrawal was so brutal because it undercut the vision we'd painted for over 20 years for them, cut their feet right off. And some of these people that I admired in the media from Afghanistan were immediately executed. And I know those executions are still happening today. One organization that goes into some harsh areas and tries to do some fair reporting is Vice, and they cover some pretty harsh stuff. And they were allowed side-by-side interviews with Taliban into their councils when they were doing judgment, and you could see the hesitation to do what they would really do on camera. But as the story continued in the background, they were like, by the way, they went back out and killed these people. So we know that what's being said in the front, just like in a lot of media today, is not necessarily the truth that's being told.
Yeah, that's what makes it really hard. And sometimes they are telling the truth, and they're just telling their truth. You know, when they said that they would respect women to the fullest extent of Islam, they were saying, you know, we think basically our version of Islam. Mm-hmm. So they, in their mind, they are respecting women by keeping them away from society and not letting them be subject to, you know, the dangers that exist for women who are out in society on their own, right? It's a very misogynistic and limited worldview, and it's also highly hypocritical, since these are the same people who are raping Afghan women in prisons, impregnating them, and sometimes killing them.
And children.
So, right. Oh, yes. I have a friend who her whole thing that she started after helping SIV applicants was now she provides crisis rape support for the children and women who are being raped by the Taliban.
Yeah, I looked over her content. Sickening. It was just so heavy that I had to step away, because it's beyond what normal people would imagine evil to be.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yep. It's sickening. So it's really hard. It's really hard stuff to look at every day.
So when we talk about PTSD, when we talk about even image-born trauma, you know, when you see things, death, even in an educated mindset where you know that this is going, you're aiming at trying to resolve or solve, you don't forget. How have you done with that trauma that you saw and still hear about today?
I think for me, I've been lucky that no one I know has been, I mean, they well could have been, and that's why I don't hear from them anymore, right? But I haven't seen the proof of it. And because I'm a journalist, my interactions mostly stop after a piece comes out and somebody feels like they've been heard. And then sometimes I get the great follow-up, hey, I'm in the US, or I get, you know, the, hey, I'm still in trouble. But I've never, there was one time that was really, I think, the scariest time. I was talking to a man who I'm still trying to get help for. He worked for U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. He can't get his supervisor letter to apply for SIV, and he's living far apart from his family because the Taliban continue to visit his home and ask where he is, and he's terrified. So early on, probably January of 2022, I get this message from him, and it's a video. And I open it up, and it's from the perspective, I'm assuming, of the Taliban member who went and was just killing someone. And I didn't know if it was him or not. And he didn't say anything in his thing. And the Taliban will do that, right? They gather your stuff, and then they send proof of death to all of your contacts. And that's what I thought it was. And so I was terrified that somebody I was trying to help had been murdered. And then I was terrified that the Taliban had my contact information. I knew who I was. And it was probably the next hour and a half were some of the most harrowing times of my life, until I finally got up the guts to say, hey, what was that? Like, are you okay? And then he's like, oh yeah, that was my, so-and-so. And I'm like, Okay, well, that's still terrible.
Yes.
But I'm very glad that it's not you. And like next time, please give me some warning.
Yeah.
So I've been separated by, a distance of however many, but then you hear, I've definitely told many stories about people whose family members were murdered by the Taliban. And I think journalism is what helps me keep the slight distance and just, I don't know. I don't really know how I got good at it. It was really hard at first. All I did in those early days was just try to answer as many messages as I could all the time while keeping my head above water, and then just trying to tell all the stories I could. It was really, really difficult, but I just pressed on.
Well, I'm glad. I know that no life is without trauma or difficulty. Yours has had some challenges of recent, and it still weighs heavy. You're still working, so it's amazing to me that personal challenges aren't deterring you from using your gift to tell the story, and to still make a difference in the world. So I salute you for that effort.
Thanks. I honestly think, and I told you this the other day, that what kept me from losing my mind while I was going through divorce, which is my big personal challenge that still remains a challenge that is, I don't get through a day without thinking about it and being angry about it and having many, many negative emotions regarding that. But Afghanistan saved me in that regard too. It reminded me, because I think it's really easy. I see it in the women I follow on social media who are going through the same thing. Not the Afghanistan part, but the divorce part, is the feeling like you're worthless. And I definitely felt that way for a time. And it was in the middle of just so many people looking to me for help and doing things right before my ex-husband exploded my life. I had just finished a piece about bachabazi. And for those who don't know what that is, it's boy play. In Pashtun cultures, I believe, is where that took off. Basically, some cultures of Afghanistan, it's men will use boys, dress them up like girls, sexually abuse them, give them to the highest power holder at the end of an event. And it's this great, it's a horrifying practice, actually, is what it is. Great is never a word that should be associated with that. But for a time, people didn't believe that the Taliban were practicing bachabazi. And it was one thing that the international community would say is, hey, at least there will be no bachabazi in Afghanistan, because the Taliban said it was not allowed during their first regime. And I had just broken a piece with an amazing evacuation volunteer about how the Taliban are in fact practicing bachabazi. And we had videos, we had pictures that showed the Taliban with their dancing boys. And here's this thing, that the world isn't talking about it. I had just broken it, and I felt like, thank goodness, here I am, I'm making a difference. And then my life exploded. And it was those moments where I was covering things that mattered to other people that reminded me that I still mattered, because I certainly did not feel like I mattered in my marriage. And I knew I mattered as a mom, but while I was fighting every day for my marriage, that was hard to, it was just a very hard time. So I am so grateful to Afghanistan, because it centered me. It gave me something, when I met Michael Cook, I think I've told this story on my podcast before, and I know I've told it to Michael many times, but the day I met Michael Cook was probably about a month before my marriage officially was done and we were going to divorce. And I had just gotten off the phone with my mom, and I had been just crying. I was so sad. I said, Mom, I don't think there's anything left to salvage here. And then I had to go, and I walked down the street, and I walked into this coffee shop, and this poor man has no idea the mess who is walking towards him right now. And I was like, oh, hey. And I asked him what everyone does. Do you pronounce your name Michael or Mikhail? Because he spells it weirdly. And he said something like, oh, it's Michael. And what do you want? I'll get your drink. And then he asked me, I said something about boats. And he said, well, where are you from? And I said, oh, I'm from Virginia Beach. He said, how'd you end up here? And I just started sobbing. And like, not like a couple tears here and there, but just sobbing. And he looked at me and he's like, okay, we're going to go outside. And he sat down with me. And I don't think I explained what was happening, and I apologized profusely. But it was him sitting with me and then talking about Afghanistan for probably 2 hours with somebody who cared about it as much as I do. I mean, my friends and family would always talk to me about it, and entertain me talking about it. But this was somebody who wanted to talk about it and who was passionate about it and had taken part in Digital Dunkirk. And that was a turning point for me. And that was when he said, you need to do a podcast. And I was like, who wants to listen to me? Because I'm, here I am thinking I'm about this big. I'm useless. I am, the only thing I was good for was in the past at NGIC. And having somebody have that faith, I went home and I started thinking about it. And then I wrote down on a piece of paper, on one side, I had all the people I thought I could interview with him. And then on the other side, I had all these Afghans, because I wanted every episode to have an Afghan story too. And I just said, okay, Michael, are you free? Like, let's get together. I have an idea. And I showed him the paper. I was like, I think we need to do this, because you have the now aspect. I have the way back when I used to be in this aspect. And I still hadn't realized. I also have the now aspect. I hadn't even realized it, but I just kept motoring on and doing this thing. And it was all of that helped me gather myself again and remember the badass I was when I was at NGIC, and the badass that I still was, and I just couldn't see it at the moment because I was looking at myself through my ex-husband's eyes and not through my own eyes. And so I've increasingly learned to do that, and I'm grateful for the people who helped me on that journey to remembering who I am.
Yeah, there's a direct parallel, and thank you for sharing that and being vulnerable to share that, because I know that people on this channel will be able to relate. There's a direct correlation to pushing down emotional trauma, burying it, and like you said, you just told them where you were from, talking about a boat, and the body holds memories. The body keeps score. When you bury these things emotionally, they will come out physically, whether in illness or emotions at random times too. And I've been there. I wanted to comment too on the resiliency that you've displayed. You talked about your time doing intel work and being able to somehow compartmentalize the trauma and the effects you were seeing and not have it come back into your home or your life. But then a personal tragedy happens, and suddenly that resiliency gives way, and you start to listen to that little voice in your head that's the negative one that says, oh, you're not good enough, you have nothing to offer, you're done, what the past was who you were, and the future is just a big failure, it's a downward slide. And I've talked about this voice in our head. There's always a good voice. The cartoons we used to watch as kids where there was an angel and a devil on the shoulder, right? It's like that exists for real, where there's always a voice that's negative. Michael, who are you to interview Beth? She's a journalist. She's published. She's involved. She's saving people's lives. What are you? I have to quiet that voice and say, if you're telling me negative things about myself, I know that's not real. What's the other side saying to me? The other side's saying, make a difference. Change a life. Tell a story. If it benefits one person out of the almost 14,000 followers I have on YouTube, success. And I know, Beth, that your work has been one that's benefited many people. When I heard your story, speaking with you last week, or was it the week before? I don't even remember. Everything kind of blends. But
I think it was last week.
Yeah. I was so inspired. I think I even said at the end of our call, Beth, we have to collaborate. We have to do something. I have to get involved here. I know that refugees have gone to different places in the United States from Afghanistan. And unfortunately, I've seen that those communities end up being just themselves, and not much outside interaction happens with those communities. So we kind of set that up in Dearborn, Michigan, with Iraqis that came over from Iraq and settled in Michigan, and they set up their own community. Didn't have a lot of outside influence coming in and saying, "Hey, welcome. Let's involve you. Let's get you." And I don't want that to happen where I live. I want to involve those who immigrate here on visas to be part of our community here too. I want them to know that there are friends who care about their lives that they've lost, their livelihoods that they've lost, their educational value that they had that no longer is valid here. Like, there are all these things that contribute to a society that's dwindling, right? And I want to be that stone that doesn't get thrown away. I want to walk forward.
I think that's a really important thing to do right now, because I know the Afghan voices I hear. For a time, I didn't even listen to anything going on in the refugee community because I felt like the giant fire was everyone stuck in Afghanistan, not able to afford food, not able to, leave their home without fear of being slaughtered, all of that. And then I started listening to the refugee community and I realized the pain is the same.
Yep.
And it's terrible, and that absolutely what you're describing is what is needed. And I've also said this on my podcast, the reason my podcast exists also, not just Michael, before I ever wrote that down, I was at a neighbor's house with my ex-husband trying to be the dutiful wife and do, instead of doing Afghanistan one night, going to waste my time with people who didn't have the same cares for the world that I did. But anyway, the neighbor then told me that he didn't think any Afghans needed to be here. Didn't matter if they worked with us or not. And that was when I said, I'm doing the podcast. I'm doing the podcast because people need to hear what's going on, and the beautiful hearts of Afghans and the openness and all of those things. And so I think it's really important that we reach out to Afghans in our community. They need jobs. Like you said, their educational training is not providing them with what they need to do the same job here. Like they have to retrain, recertify, do whatever. I've got one brilliant Afghan woman who is a professor, can't get a retail job at Kroger or Target. She's applied for so many jobs and never gets them. And she speaks beautiful English. So I don't understand it. And there's so much pain. There's so much trauma that they've been collecting in the lead up to the withdrawal, during the withdrawal, after the withdrawal. No matter when and where they came here, they're carrying so much pain with them and if they aren't carrying it, their families are carrying it, and they're being asked to pick up the slack of, their family can't make money under the Taliban, and now they have to send money. There's just so many levels of pain. So I really admire your thoughts on that. I think it's a very important thing to do right now.
If there's anyone on this channel or watching this video today that has that same ignorant mindset, I would challenge you to do a little family history. Go to familysearch.com, go to ancestry.com, go back in your history and see how far back it took for you to have an immigrant come to the United States or to England or to Canada, and see what their journey was like and the persecution that they received. So don't tell me that you can't relate with those people, because your ancestors definitely could. All of us are transplants from someplace. I love the fact that you think globally. You have that world outlook. I wish that more people had that same viewpoint, because then we stop looking at each other as foreigners. We start looking at each other as brothers and sisters, and we start to make a difference in people's lives, which is what I want to do. After we get off this call, I've got an idea I want to share with you, and you tell me what your thoughts are. But in the last 2 minutes here, Beth, and this has been absolutely wonderful. I could listen to you tell stories for hours. It's no wonder that your gift is in sharing those things. So when that voice is negative in your mind and saying you don't have value, don't add value, push it right out. Hear my voice in your ear and saying, Beth, you've got the gift. Keep sharing it. Can you give me some advice here in the last 2 minutes for anyone who's listening, who's wondering how they can contribute, how they can help, what would you suggest?
Ooh, it depends on if you want to donate time or if you want to donate money. Money is absolutely all of these
Always.
groups that are trying to help. They are out of money. They aren't able to afford food packages and continued safe houses and things of that nature. But if you have a skill set that lends itself well to supporting refugees, which that's any skill set, honestly. Like, tell me what you can do, and I'll tell you how you can apply it to helping Afghans or helping refugees or anything. I would look into the evacuation groups that are always looking for new volunteers who want to come on. I think I would say No One Left Behind. I know that they were looking for mentors for Afghans who have come here so that they can get on their feet and figure out a job. There are plenty of groups that are geographically located that always need help. My friend John Moses at Massachusetts Afghan Alliance always needs volunteers. And that's the same anywhere. There's, oh my goodness, in DC, React DC, great one. I'm sure that they can use volunteer. They're just everywhere. Just look for a group that helps refugees, or look for one of the evacuation groups still helping people that are left behind, and you will find a place to use your skill set.
Awesome. Awesome. I love it. Beth, thanks so much for your time today. I appreciate you sharing your gift with us, and continue doing this great work to bring these things to light. And Beth will share with me her contact information for you to reach out to her. She'll share with me her social media account, some of the groups that she's worked with. I'll post that in the description below. Like, share, and subscribe. And follow her on her account. Watch her journey as she continues to share these wonderful things that make a difference in people's lives. Remember that I want you to do something hard today. Get out of your own head. Get outside. Enjoy life. But also try to reach outward and make a difference in someone else's life. Love you guys. Thanks for connecting. Beth, thanks very much again.
Thank you, Michael.